Mr. White had asked me, I think Mr. White has prepared a presentation that he's been working on since our last discussion of the budget. So I'm going to yield the floor to Mr. White. And
thank you, Ms. Gant. What I had asked for, just for the rest of the board members in the audience, I really wanted to put some thoughts on paper. I find it actually easier to think and talk in pictures. It makes it simpler. But there's some things that are going on I think we really need to start talking about and thinking about. And one thing I wanted, and I just asked that I could have a few minutes to do this, and then any board member can have equal time if I can just do it, without interruption. But one of the issues I think all of us struggle with every time we enter a budget session is having to raise millage. Nobody up here likes it. We're under a lot of stress and pressure when we're torn between trying to disassemble this school district versus not raise millage. And we really do, I think, empathize with the businesses that are. I know John D. represents small business and is making us all very aware of how painful it is when we talk about raising millage. And I want to say that we do understand and we do consider that, but there's a much broader picture here I want to paint and talk about for a few minutes. And part of that is we didn't decide how the funding comes to these schools. That was decided by the General Assembly, and they made a very important decision when they passed Act 388 that we don't agree with, but we have to live with it. And one of the things I think, in addition to all of Steve's accolades that steps out of my mind, was when he first got here, the economy had just crashed. It was 2008. We were creeping along, or shortly after that, the next year, and everything was dead. Real estate sales were flat. Nobody knew where we were going in the economy. And you had a very astute observation, and this is something I want to share with the board, is you basically said, this is being a bedroom community. There's not a lot of industry here. That it really, the reason people move here is to either, if they want and have the means to live on the lake, or they're generally here because of the schools, or maybe they're from Irmo. I came here because of the schools. As soon as our kids reached kindergarten age, we moved here from downtown Columbia, where I work. But the most profound thing you said was these schools really support this local economy. And it reminded me of a book, an author, Harry Dent, had written a book in the early 90s about the roaring times. He accurately predicted the roaring times with this chart right here of the great economic expansion we had in the 1990s. And what he noticed was that the economy grew as there were spikes in birth rates, and it was all back to a chart he noticed that the U.S. Census Bureau published that tracked the life cycle of consumer spending. And what this chart shows on the bottom are people's ages, and I think this is principally the bread earner in the family, the earner. And on the vertical side is the spending. And you can see as somebody is in their early 20s, their spending is very low and it's very flat. And as they approach age 25 and they start to get married, their spending starts to turn upward, and it's almost a 90-degree incline. And what that line represents going up is accelerating spending by the family. As they're having kids, they're getting married, they're buying their starter homes, and that continues until about age 46 for the average person. And then as the kids begin to enter college, their spending starts to decline for the rest of their lives until, average age, I guess, is 90 today. But there's a couple of key observations, and I want to tie this back to your observation about these schools really supporting the economy. And the first is, think about if you've had kids, or you're having kids, or if you've watched people around you, or your kids are grown, what were you spending money on when your kids were growing up, or your neighbors' kids were growing up? What were they spending money on, and where were you spending it? I can tell you, for somebody that moved to this community, 90% of my disposable income for the last 15 years has been spent right here in Irmo. I work downtown, I live downtown, but for these schools, all that money would have been spent in downtown Columbia. I would have lived in downtown Columbia. The other important observation, and again, if you're on this other side of age 46, look at the types of expenditures. People start contracting their spending, and they're not spending as much, but they're not spending as, to the extent they are spending, it's not localized spending. They're buying vacation homes, they're getting cruise ships. If you're not a drugstore or a hospital or nursing home, you're not a primary beneficiary of the big dollars being spent once they turn that corner. And I've got 2 kids in college now, and I've got one left in Dutch Fork High School. He'll be a senior next year. But I can tell you, most of my money's going out of this community now because I've got 2, and I'm funding everything they're doing. Their colleges are not here. And, you know, if what I'm wanting everybody to recognize is when you say, what do these schools do for this community? They educate our kids. They provide a great education for our kids, but they repopulate households as homes are sold to families that are going into their peak accelerating years of spending. Those dollars go into our businesses, those dollars go into our local economy, and those dollars circulate. I mean, you know, economists do studies, and you have to do it localized, but it gets spent more than once in the local community. When we start trending down that curve, if we want to repopulate or not populate our home with young families, we may, I don't know what it'll look like, but we may end up with a greater percentage of the population that is shrinking what they're spending. That's going to affect businesses in the long term, and I can tell you, going through that downturn in 2008, going through the whole calamity with, you know, seated board members trying to block schools that were being built, that were approved in the referendum, people started going to Lexington 1 instead of District 5. And we are no longer the school district of choice. And I've seen it through people that we know, and I've instances we've heard on the board. Every family that moves to another district because they don't want to come here, if it's political problems or if we go through economic decline or we're at a crossroads, if we make a decision that starts to debilitate or destroy these schools, not only are we affecting the kids in these schools, the customers of the business in this community will go where those families go. Those dollars will be spent in those communities and not our community. Here's just another graph from Harry Dent's book, the same thing, and what I would submit to you, we've got some serious flaws in the funding mechanism, and what we look like, I think since the time I've been here, if you look at the 46, where you peak out in your spending as a family, traditionally this community has been populated with a lot of the young families on the left side. If we ignore these schools and what it takes to run these schools, we may end up looking like there's nothing wrong with retirees, except they don't spend as much money in businesses. And what I would submit to you, it's going to hurt businesses more in the long run to deny these schools the funding they have to have. One of the questions that was asked last meeting, it was very insightful for me, and it actually just clicked, and that's when this stuff started popping in my mind in pictures. But you know, why did our budget, and this is one typo I found, why did our budget increase $31 million? It's actually, I used all of Lynn's numbers. I sent this to Lynn. He provided me these numbers. If you add all these up, it's right at almost $30 million. So, and I actually had my assistant, she was supposed to have corrected that, so that is one typo. It's almost $30 million over the last 7 years. And I want to come back to that in a little bit. But this is basically the average increases. And I sat there in the meeting, and I remembered from days gone by when Dan Chandler would tell us, on average, our expenses trend up 5 to 7%. That's not doing anything different, nothing new. They trend up. And that's the short answer why our budget increases, because prices increase. And if we were a business, we'd have 3 choices. We could do nothing and make less money. We could try to cut our costs if we could keep our costs cut below the price increases, or we could raise our prices. or we could cut our costs and raise our prices. We're not a business. We only have one way to get additional revenue, and that's through a millage increase. We do cut costs every year, and I'll show you, I mean, they've cut them this year since our last budget session. But if you look at this, I did a simple calculation in our last budget discussion because I asked Lynn in live session what on average was our prices increasing, and you said currently it's 3.5%. It was 5 to 7, and you know, before the economy crashed, it's 3.5% today. I did simple math. You can take the beginning year and multiply it times 1.035 7 times, and you're going to be real close to our budget proposed for this year. But I think the short answer is our budget will go up regardless of whether we add students because our costs go up. One of the most significant ones I want to show an illustration is the step increase. The step increase is a mandatory bump in the compensation that we give to certain teachers. It doesn't go to all teachers. The step increase, I didn't go back and calculate this. I think it's more important to look to the future than to try to reconcile the past because we can sit here forever spinning around between people, you know, saying, well, you did this or you didn't do that. But what's really important is the future, but I can tell you the step increase probably is half of that entire $30 million. And that's a mandatory increase that we have to make by statute. For this year, Steve showed and Lynn showed our budget increase is $3,094,000. I can tell you it did go. Ken's not here. I wish he had stayed to hear this because I know he's one of the business owners that's concerned. But you know, he challenged us to reduce it from make a $1.6 million reduction. I can tell you, since our budget last time, Lynn has reduced it 1.4 because when I created these charts, I'm going to show you in a minute, our deficit was $4.4 million. It was a much larger deficit, and I'll show you the ramifications of that. But what I wanted to do is just show everybody on the right-hand side. I mean, this is detailed in Lynn's chart, but what does this really represent? Well, $768,375 in that green box, that's growth. That's new teachers because of new schools. And we're not the only school district in this state that builds new schools when you have to have them, when you need adequate facilities for kids. Lexington 1 is doing it, District 2 is doing it. We made a decision, and the taxpayers made a decision back in 2008, they were going to build and fund new schools, period. There is no debate about whether we're open or closed. You know, you just told us people are coming from halfway around the world to see this facility right here. The public approved that. It costs money to open new schools. One of the other things that people have got, and this is what really, I took the time to put this in a PowerPoint because what I've been sharing with some of the board members, we really need to start a broader conversation, not just as every year we go into budget, we put our heads down, we get people coming out of the public, we're under a lot of stress. We do everything we can, hope the administration will find a way to cut some of the numbers off, and maybe we can make everybody happy. And we try and hope and pray that it'll all come out better next year. We've got to stop this tunnel vision because we've got a bigger problem, and it's not because we're misspending, it's not because we don't know what we're doing, that you don't know what you're doing running a school district. I mean, you just became superintendent of the year. Our problem is related to the mechanics of funding schools. And because we're a great school district, we're not getting a lot of attention. And this second line item is part of a new problem that just arrived last year. The General Assembly, because they have an obligation to fund the schools in the corridor of shame, they're redirecting funds from other pools of money. This is not the base student cost. This is not the number we normally key in on and say, okay, if we only got the base student cost, which is the Budget Controls Board's estimate of what it costs, the incremental cost of funding schools, we can't talk about base student costs anymore because they're shifting money from other sources. This year, it was $1,167,000. I think last year it was close to $1 million. I think it was $2 million last year. We talked to Nathan Ballantyne at the graduations last week, and he said it, because I had a chance to sit down with Nathan, And where I'm going with this whole conversation is, as a board, we need to start a broader conversation with the community. We need to help the community understand this. We need to help businesses understand it. We need to help Chamber of Commerce's understand it. And then we need to start communicating with the General Assembly, because it's not going to change any other way. It won't get better on its own. And this revenue shift, when I was showing this to Nathan Ballantyne, he shared with me, they're talking about taking away more money next year. So, you know, things are going in the wrong direction, and it has nothing to do with the number of students we have. This blue box, those are what I call our inflation items. Utility increases, liability insurance increase. We're being charged more for SRO officers. We were a leader in the state 2 years ago to put SRO officers in all of our schools. I don't think anybody, it was over $1 million of extra in our budget to fund security in those schools. And I don't think anybody would back step on that decision. In today's world, we live in a dangerous world, and we made a decision with the advice of the law enforcement divisions of our district that we ought to do that. The most dangerous thing we confront, I'm going to show you some charts, is this step increase. And I can tell you from the times that we've toyed with teachers and salaries and trying to give raises, a lot of years this doesn't even cover the incremental costs of teachers' health benefits. They don't consider this a raise, but it's a $2 million item this year. It's mandated by statute, and I'm going to show you what it's doing in a moment. These are all the reductions they've made so far this year. And again, they came down from 4.4 to a little over $3 million. But I really want to show you how this step increase highlights the flaw in our budget. And if we start with our budget and say, okay, right now we have a $3.1 million deficit. I mean, our expenses are more. The problem is these are reoccurring expenses. They occur every year. So if we say we're not going to raise, a reoccurring expense has to have reoccurring revenue. And if we're not going to find recurring revenue, that same $3.1 million shows up next year, and the step increase for next year is $2.4 million. And I'm making an assumption in this table that none of our costs go up except the step increase. Our revenue is constant from the state. We don't have any utility increase, no insurance increase. We don't have any more increases on SRO officers. This is the one single item. That is not a realistic assumption. It's a very conservative portrayal. But if we do nothing, this is what happens. It layers year after year after year. Our costs increase. We're not adding any students. We're not giving teachers raises. We're having a step increase each year. And if you look at the last box on the right-hand corner, this is 7 years going forward. This was a question of why did our budget go up so much in 7 years? This is 7 years in the future. Doing nothing, it'll go up $20 million just for a step increase. And the problem with the step increase, and Carl Fulmer warned us of this back in the days after the economy crashed, that one of the problems with Act 388 was you got locked in and you were given revenue by the state at the level you had raised your millage the year before it came effective in 2007. And people were racing to raise their millage in other districts. We always struggled to fund our budget and keep our millage as low as possible. The day Act 88 came effective in 2007, we were frozen. The equivalent, this is Carl Fulmer's language, the equivalent of $8 million below Lexington 1 after you adjust for difference in pupil populations. They don't have this problem yet. They had an $8 million cushion ahead of us because they weren't being as conservative with their millage and more conscious of their taxpayers year to year prior to Act 388 taking effect. But if we come back and say, and this next chart is to show, okay, if we were to do what people ask us to do is cut okay, here, and I'm going to promise you this rhetoric is old, it's tired. I've been hearing it since I've got on this board 12 years ago. reduce administrative costs, don't reduce teachers, don't hurt education. That is an impossible scenario, and this is what this chart shows you. Each one of these, the bottom yellow line, these are the cuts needed to fund a balance, if we want to balance each year. It's the diagonal line because if we're able to cut one year, it doesn't carry over to the next, so it doesn't compound. But we would have to cut $3.1 million in addition to the $1.4 million you've already cut. Then we got our step increase next year. We have to cut $2.4 million each year after that just to stay in balance, assuming no other cost increases come into the picture. And just for the sake of argument, and this is something that I actually had fun with when I created this chart, if you look at my arrow, delete 100% of administrative positions, if we started deleting administrative positions, we have approximately $15 million administrative salaries. We would not have a single administrator left on our payroll somewhere in 2019. And what we talked about, Steve, at the graduation is how brilliant of a career this would be to have won the Superintendent of the Year award twice. And then he finished his career by basically teaching his teachers how to completely manage and run a school district with no administrative positions. They would have to do everything from preparing the food, driving the buses, patrolling the schools, hosting school board meetings. You'd have to be the principal, you'd have to be the disciplinarian, the parking lots attendants. Everything somebody else does for you, Steve could show what a great job he did teaching them how to manage themselves, and you'd be the last one we would fire, and you would be brilliant, and everybody would try to emulate, and just think from the taxpayer's perspective how much more work we're getting out of the same people. And then, but still, it doesn't stop. Another $2.4 million the next year, another $2.4 million. We would then start spending our fund balance, and we would be completely out of money and no administrators in 2021. But the best thing about this approach is we would have followed the desires of the people that said, make do with the money you have. And I'm not calling anybody out here tonight because I've heard that argument for 13 years. That is, you're supposed to survive on the money you get. The problem is the money we get is not designed to cover our costs. And this is an illustration where I've added the green boxes for all these same years to show you if we raise, the first year is one of the considerations. This is the only year we can go back 3 years and pick up a year we did not raise millage. And during that time, nobody foresaw, I know Carl Farmer was here, and he was the one that recommended. I mean, our CFO recommended we not raise millage. And he recommended it because he felt like we'd been through tough times and we needed to give the taxpayers some relief. But nobody saw that the state was going to start shifting money away from us again. But the $3.7 million is for one time we could raise it 3.7. The normal allotment of millage to us is this $1.5 million that appears in each of the succeeding years in that green box. And if you net those two numbers, that's the maximum millage we can raise under the CPI or using this 3-year look back. We have a little bit of extra money this year, but we have deficits starting the next year. This is adding no new students and no other costs going up, which is a totally unrealistic set of assumptions. And then it goes from 0.3 million, 1.2 million, and even these alone with that CPI increase every year into the future is not enough money. And every dollar we pass on in millage is another level of expenses that keep showing up year after year after year. The thing that, again, if we were to cut, the numbers are smaller. The yellow diagonal, that's the final year, because if you cut 1 year, it doesn't carry over and accumulate like it did in the prior years. But we wouldn't need anything to cut this year, but we'd have to cut 0.3 next year. And then 0.9, this bottom line, this yellow bottom line, another million. It's about 0.9 million, which is the difference between those scenarios. The one thing that's missing from this whole conversation, is this manageable? Maybe. Will it start hurting year after year after year, a million, a million, a million? Well, in reality, our costs are going to be going up. These numbers are understated. But the thing that's missing from this whole conversation for the next 7 years is there's no teacher raises in there. And one of the things that Carl Fulmer, sorry, Lynn, if I keep quoting your predecessor, you weren't talking to us back then, but Carl said, you know, he had a concern because of the way Act 388 started, and there were inequities in funding. The way people started with their millage, we may not be able to keep up when the economy gets better and people start competing for our best talent. I know one of the recommendations tonight was that we have early retirement plans to get rid of the higher paid people. I can tell you, for the business people, I just read a book from Jack Welch that said that is the absolute wrong thing to do. You're inviting your very best people to walk out the door and then go get a job somewhere else if they aren't finished working. So we want our best people to leverage and multiply their skills across our workforce. Here's a reality scenario, okay? At some point in time, we've got to give our staff raises or we're going to lose our best people. I arbitrarily put it in at 3% raise in 2017. And you can see what it does to the deficits. They're compounding again. You know, in 2017, it's basically a $5.4 million deficit every year, each and every year thereafter. I go back to where I started. If you look at this graph, and recognize the person that used this graph to interpret this predicted the greatest economic boom we've had in the century when everybody else was saying the world was falling apart. And he used this simple graph right here. And my message to this board and to the community is we want great education for our kids, but for our property values, for our businesses, for the long-term survival of this community, do we want to keep repopulating with young families that are accelerating their spending in this community, or do we want to send them to other districts? And anybody that loves the lake can go right across the dam and have a totally different school system, and maybe we end up with communities where less of the money is spent locally and less of the money is spent overall. And I say to you again, I think where we are today, we've been on the left side of this graph or this depiction. If we're not careful in what we do, we may end up on the right side. Not that it's bad that we have empty nesters and retired folks. It's just our businesses will suffer, and they'll suffer more than the taxes if we destroy these schools. And if we make a wrong decision today, we could actually destroy these schools. I will say, we did have a chance to talk to Nathan Ballantyne. He did say when y'all are ready to talk. What I wanted to do was present this message. We need to hone this. I mean, I'm not making any of this up. It's just fact. And we need to have a broader conversation with business leaders, with chambers of commerce, community groups, and have them help us talk to the legislature, because the only way this is going to change if they start putting more money directly into these schools. And I can tell you right now, it is horribly unfair that businesses in this community have to bear the burden of this. We didn't make that policy decision, but I know Lynn said this very eloquently to me at graduation. There are about 10 or 12 school districts in this state that are harmed disproportionately under Act 388, and we're one of them because we're a bedroom community. We don't have a lot of businesses. We don't have a big tax base to spread this around. We also have growth, and we have high socioeconomics. And what's happening is that growth costs money, but the high socioeconomics means the state is also shifting money away from this district. And I hate to say it, but when you go back to this chart right here, our taxpayers are funding the money that's being exported out of this district to other districts. I mean, that is coming. If we have to cover that with millage, then our taxpayers are funding, I'm sorry, I can't get back. It's this number right here, the $1.1 million this year. If we have to cover that with millage, our taxpayers are funding schools in other communities. Those are the sort of inequities we need to start the conversation. And it's an impossible situation. I mean, I wish I could say something positive about it, but I've said my.
Mr. White, thank you for that presentation. For the rest of the board, again, that was a continuation of our last discussion of the budget, but I'm fully aware that we're in a budget workshop. Anybody that needs that much time or more time, you are welcome to it. But the floor is open now for any other discussion. Ms. Baumgartner.